April 1st, 1942. A cold dawn crept over the deck of the USS Hornet, the wind sharp, the Pacific stretching endless in every direction. 69 men stood shoulder to shoulder in flight jackets and fur-lined helmets, their breath visible in the morning haze. Parked before them, towering over the narrow carrier deck, were 16 squat twin-engine bombers, their olive-drab bodies looking entirely out of place on a ship designed for slender naval fighters. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, small in stature but radiating unshakable confidence, stood at the front of the formation. His flight suit was worn, his boots scuffed, and his eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind him, B-25 Mitchell bombers lined the deck, each with Tokyo written invisibly across its nose. "Gentlemen," he said, voice steady despite the whipping wind, "we're about to do something that's never been done before." The men listened, their faces set, though beneath their calm, they all understood the truth. This was a mission built on risk, faith, and a healthy dose of American audacity. Just 4 months earlier, Pearl Harbor had burned. The Japanese Empire's surprise attack had killed over 2,400 Americans and crippled the Pacific Fleet. In Tokyo, the mood had been triumphant. Japan now ruled the Pacific, its armies sweeping through the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. They believed the United States had neither the will nor the means to strike back soon. But in Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt wanted an answer. A message to friend and foe alike that America was far from beaten. He turned to the Army Air Forces and asked a simple question that no one yet knew how to answer. Could we bomb Japan? The idea seemed impossible. Japan was thousands of miles from any Allied base. Conventional bombers couldn't fly that far, and no American aircraft carrier could accommodate the takeoff or landing of large bombers. Yet, out of that impossibility came the spark of Doolittle's genius. If the bombers couldn't reach Japan from land, perhaps they could from the sea, launched from a carrier, even if they could never return. It was a plan no sane commander would approve. B-25s were never meant for carrier use. Their wingspan was too wide, their engines too heavy, their takeoff run far too long. But Doolittle, a test pilot, engineer, and visionary, wasn't deterred by impossible. In February 1942, at Eglin Field in Florida, Doolittle and his hand-picked crews began the tests. They stripped their bombers of anything unnecessary, guns, armor, even radios, replacing them with extra fuel tanks. They practiced taking off from runways marked with chalk lines the exact length of a carrier deck, just 467 feet. On the first run, a pilot jammed the throttle forward, the engines roaring, propellers clawing the air. The B-25 lifted barely 30 feet before its wheels left the ground, but it flew, barely. By March, the experiment had become a mission. 16 B-25 B. Mitchell bombers were chosen, each to carry 4 bombs, a mix of incendiary and high-explosive payloads, bound for Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. No one promised survival. As the Hornet steamed westward under radio silence, escorted by the aircraft carrier Enterprise and a screen of destroyers and cruisers, the men of the 17th Bomb Group spent their days inspecting, checking, and rechecking their aircraft. On the bomb bay doors of one plane, someone painted a cartoon of Donald Duck hurling a bomb. Another bore the words, "Ruptured Duck." They knew the odds. Once they launched, they would have no way to return to the carrier. The plan was to bomb Japan, then continue west to China, landing, if they were lucky, on airfields controlled by the Chinese resistance. If they were unlucky, they would crash, bail out, or die trying. On April 18, 1942, before dawn, the task force steamed 650 miles east of Japan. much closer than any American carrier had ever dared. The sea was rough, waves slamming against the deck. The crews were eating breakfast below when the klaxon sounded. A Japanese patrol vessel, the Nito Maru, had sighted the task force. There was no time left. The plan had been to launch from 450 miles away, not 650. That extra distance meant one thing. There would be no fuel left to reach China. Doolittle was told the risk. He didn't hesitate. "We launch now," he said simply. "We'll make it work." Moments later, the first bomber was rolled into position at the bow. The ship pitched violently with each swell. The deck was slick with spray. At 8:20 a.m., Doolittle climbed into his cockpit. The engines thundered, the twin propellers spinning up to a deafening pitch. He glanced down the impossibly short deck and pushed the throttles to full. The B-25 lurched forward. Crewmen ducked as the bomber raced past, its wheels hammering the deck. For a heartbeat, it looked doomed, the nose dipping toward the sea. Then, as if defying gravity itself, the bomber rose, its wings slicing through the wind. The men below erupted in cheers. One by one, the other 15 followed. The final plane roared into the air at 9:19 a.m., its landing gear barely clearing the carrier's bow. 16 bombers were now alone, heading west over the gray Pacific, bound for Tokyo. They had no fighter escort, no radio contact, no margin for error, only a mission and a message. The sleeping giant was awake. April 18th, 1942. Noon, the Japanese mainland. For the people of Tokyo, it began as an ordinary Saturday. Housewives hung laundry from narrow balconies. Children in school uniforms marched to lessons. The streets bustled with carts, bicycles, and the chatter of a nation at war, but untouched by it. Then, just after noon, the first air raid sirens wailed. To many, it was almost routine. A false alarm, perhaps. Japan's cities had conducted countless drills since the war began. No one believed an enemy plane could actually reach them. The Imperial Navy ruled the Pacific. The Americans, everyone said, had been crippled at Pearl Harbor. But as people looked up, they saw them. 16 twin-engine bombers, flying low, silver glints slicing through the haze. The sound was wrong. Deeper, heavier than anything they knew. And emblazoned on the wings, impossible yet unmistakable, was the white star of the United States. One witness later described it as a moment where the sky itself betrayed us. The first bombs fell on an oil storage facility along Tokyo Bay. The blast sent a column of black smoke towering into the sky. Seconds later, explosions erupted across the city. Factories, warehouses, and a few unlucky residential blocks. The earth trembled. Windows shattered for miles. In one B-25, Lieutenant Travis Hoover adjusted his altitude as flak burst around him. The Japanese defenses were confused, their guns firing erratically. Too high, too late. Hoover banked sharply, released his payload, and shouted to his crew, "Bombs away!" Below, terrified civilians scattered through the streets as incendiaries ignited rooftops. The fires were small compared to what would come later in the war, but in that moment, they burned through Japan's illusion of safety. Inside another bomber, Captain Ted Lawson gritted his teeth as his aircraft shuddered from turbulence. His co-pilot, Dean Davenport, leaned over the map. "We're on course," he said. Lawson glanced at the clock. 12 minutes since the first bomb. They'd done it. Tokyo was burning. He looked down and saw flashes of sunlight on the Sumida River. Rows of small boats rocking from the concussions. He thought of Pearl Harbor, of the smoke and wreckage, of the friends he'd buried. Then quietly, he said what every man in the air was thinking. This is for them. The bombers scattered after their runs, heading south and west. Some toward Nagoya, others toward Kobe and Yokohama. They flew low, hugging the terrain to avoid interception. A few Japanese fighters scrambled in pursuit, but the confusion was total. No one had expected American planes from the east. In Tokyo, panic rippled through the government. Reports flooded in. Fires in multiple cities, unknown numbers of attackers, no clear origin. General Hideki Tojo, Japan's prime minister, was informed within the hour. He demanded to know how enemy aircraft had reached the homeland. No one could answer him. For the Japanese people, the shock was devastating. Propaganda had promised invulnerability. Now, the impossible had happened. American bombs had fallen on the emperor's capital. For the Americans, it was vindication. By late afternoon, Doolittle's bombers were over open water again. But new problems arose. The extra miles forced by the early launch meant fuel was dangerously low. Every crewman knew the math didn't add up. China was still hundreds of miles away. Doolittle himself checked his gauges. The needle trembled near empty. He turned to his co-pilot, Lieutenant Richard Cole. "We're not going to make it," he said matter-of-factly. Cole nodded. "Then we'll go as far as she'll take us." Night fell as the planes crossed the coast of China, rain lashing their canopies. With fuel exhausted and visibility near zero, Doolittle gave the order. "Bail out." One by one, the crews jumped into darkness, parachutes opening like pale flowers against the storm. Some landed in rice paddies. Others struck trees, roofs, or sheer mountain slopes. Doolittle himself tumbled through the black void and hit the ground hard, losing his shoes and nearly his life. In the morning, he found himself in a muddy field, soaked to the bone, his body bruised but intact. Around him, peasants in straw hats approached cautiously. They pointed to the sky, then to the direction of the Japanese, and gestured for him to hide. Within days, Chinese partisans and farmers were sheltering the downed Americans, smuggling them west through enemy-held territory. But not all were so lucky. 2 crews were captured by the Japanese in occupied China. 3 were executed after brutal interrogation. 1 died in captivity. The rest endured years of imprisonment. Still, against every odd, most of Doolittle's men survived, rescued by Chinese guerrillas who risked their lives to protect them. Thousands of Chinese civilians would later die in Japanese reprisals for that act of mercy. When Doolittle finally reached Chongqing, the Chinese capital, he was convinced he would be court-martialed. The raid had been bold, yes, but strategically reckless. 15 of 16 bombers were lost. The damage inflicted was minor. He had expected a reprimand, or worse. Instead, when he returned to the United States weeks later, he was greeted as a hero. Parades, medals, applause. President Roosevelt himself pinned the Medal of Honor on Doolittle's chest. "You have given us victory," Roosevelt said. Not of destruction, but of spirit. Across America, newspapers blared the headlines. "Doolittle bombs Tokyo." It was the first time since Pearl Harbor that Americans could cheer. And for the Japanese, it was something far darker. Because as the smoke cleared over Tokyo, the generals of the empire began to understand a new and terrible truth. The Americans were not retreating. They were coming, and this was only the beginning. April 19th, 1942, Tokyo. The fires had been extinguished, but the smoke still hung heavy over the city. In the heart of the Imperial General Headquarters, the air was equally thick with disbelief. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo stood silent as a staff officer read the latest reports. 16 enemy aircraft had attacked Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. The bombers had flown in from the east, from the direction of the Pacific Ocean. From the ocean. That should have been impossible. American planes? Admiral Nagano asked quietly, his voice trembling with restrained fury. From where? Where could they have launched? No one answered. The silence was broken only by the rustle of papers and the distant hum of telephones. The Japanese Navy had sworn the eastern approaches to Japan were secure. The Imperial Army had promised that the homeland was untouchable. But now, for the first time, the unthinkable had happened. The enemy had struck the Emperor's capital. Tojo slammed his fist on the table. "Find them," he said. "Find where they came from." The Navy's intelligence officers scrambled through intercepted signals and reports. Within hours, a patrol submarine confirmed what no one wanted to hear. American aircraft carriers had been spotted east of Japan earlier that morning, moving at full speed back into the Pacific. The humiliation was unbearable. In the newspapers the next day, the damage was described as minimal. Just a few fires, a handful of casualties. But the emotional blow was far deeper. The Japanese public, once assured of their empire's invincibility, now saw the cracks in its armor. One Tokyo resident later recalled, "We had been told the war was far away, that Japan was a fortress. Then the sky opened, and we saw the truth. The war could reach us too." The propaganda machine worked overtime to suppress panic. Newspapers framed the raid as a reckless American stunt. Broadcasters mocked it as a cowardly hit and run. But behind closed doors, the reaction was very different. For Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the Doolittle Raid confirmed his worst fear, that the Americans were unpredictable, resilient, and relentless. He had warned Japan's high command before the war began. "I can run wild for 6 months, but after that, I have no expectation of success." Now, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, his prophecy was unfolding. The Americans had not been cowed. They had struck back, boldly, impossibly, and with precision. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Within days of the raid, Japan launched Operation Me, the plan that would lead to the Battle of Midway. The purpose was twofold: to draw the remaining U.S. carriers into a decisive battle and to extend Japan's defensive perimeter farther east, ensuring no future raids could reach the homeland. But in pursuing vengeance, the Japanese High Command made a fatal mistake. They underestimated how much the Americans had already learned and how fast they were adapting. In Washington, President Roosevelt received the news of the raid's success in his private study. When reporters asked him where the bombers had come from, he smiled faintly and said, "They flew from our secret base in Shangri-La." It was a joke, of course. But behind that humor lay a powerful truth. Morale in the United States had shifted overnight. Across the country, factories roared louder, enlistments surged, and war bond sales skyrocketed. Headlines blared the message that had been missing since December 7th. America fights back. At the Grumman plant in Long Island, mechanics painted "Remember Tokyo" on the sides of new F-4F Wildcats and TBF Avengers. At Boeing, assembly lines for B-17S and the new B-29 Superfortresses accelerated production. The raid had not crippled Japan's war machine, but it had lit a fire under America's. For Doolittle himself, the psychological transformation of a nation mattered more than any strategic gain. He later told an interviewer, "We didn't go to destroy Japan. We went to let them know that they had awakened something they couldn't put back to sleep." Meanwhile, the Japanese military responded with the only tool it knew: escalation. In China, where the American airmen had landed or crashed, Japanese forces launched a brutal campaign of reprisal known as the Zhejiang Jiangxi Campaign. Entire villages suspected of aiding the Doolittle Raiders were destroyed. Tens of thousands of civilians were executed. The Imperial Army burned crops, poisoned wells, and slaughtered livestock to deny the Chinese guerrillas any support. For every bomb dropped on Tokyo, Japan took its revenge 100-fold. And yet, even this fury could not erase the humiliation. The Doolittle Raid became a ghost that haunted the Japanese high command. It forced them to stretch their defenses thin, to chase threats in every direction, east toward Midway, south toward the Solomons, west toward India. Each move spread their empire thinner. Each battle drained their pilots, ships, and fuel reserves. And less than 2 months later, Yamamoto's fleet sailed into the trap that would decide the Pacific's future. Midway, the Doolittle Raid had not just avenged Pearl Harbor. It had set the stage for Japan's greatest defeat. For the first time in centuries, Japan had been struck at home. And for the Americans, it was proof that even in the darkest days, the fight was only beginning. The tide of war was turning, not with overwhelming firepower, but with courage, daring, and the quiet resolve of men willing to defy the impossible. As Doolittle later said, standing before his squadron years after the war, it wasn't the bombs that changed the world that day. It was the belief that we could hit back and that we would never stop.